I'm Sam Kimball with Workforce Delivery Inc. Welcome to part 3 of our podcast series on Right Here, Right Now, which is Stephen Harper's book discussing populism and governing in the age of disruption. And the purpose of this series is to understand the concepts that Prime Minister Harper is introducing in his book, and then testing as to whether or not there's certain of those concepts or observations which we may want to apply in the field of labor relations, whether it's in the strategy part of labor relations, the relations part, or whether it can be applied, certain of those factors can be applied in collective bargaining themselves. So we believe that's going to be an interesting exploration, and as a practitioner who's been at it for a while, it's just important to keep learning and testing and trying new things. So that's why I'm doing it, and thanks for joining us. We're into the book review portion of our series, and where we left off last time was on globalism, nationalism, and patriotism. Now, globalism versus nationalism, and the brand of nationalism that we're seeing today is to a large extent shaped by populism, and populism driven by economic self-interest, which many write off or minimize as just selfish interest. And Mr. Harper is quick to allay that approach slightly and makes the observation that for many working class Americans and Canadians, the need to protect or to have some protection from globalist forces within their own national economy is a matter of economic necessity. So not selfish at all, just a necessity. Mr. Harper goes on to say the antidote for the populism that arises from this is not to chastise or minimize those that turn towards our country first attitude, as doing so will only harden their position and inspire further reaction, may even in fact create the brand of nationalism that none of us desire. Mr. Harper also finds it ironic that those who travel to the Davos conferences for globalist conventions do so to exclusive locations, distance from the citizens that are often found worthy of being left behind, that tend to be acceptable lost as couched in concepts such as just transition. And he says this isn't exactly a new phenomena, and there's a historical context to dividing and leaving behind certain segments of our society, and reflects on post-World War, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe and other Western democracies had in fact a pretty strong necessity to guard against excessive nationalism, and in fact set up structures such as the United Nations, NATO, and Europe even went further in their integration in developing the European Union as a guard to balance against nationalism to some extent. And during this time, with this coming together of ultranational groups, versions of conservative economic policy were adopted by most parties and movements, and even those on the left. So whether it was center-right or center-left parties, conservative economic policies were adopted by each. And in order to differentiate themselves, and when it came time for election, that's where, instead of differentiating as much on the realm of a fairly narrow now economic policy field, that's when parties turn to culture wars and identity politics to differentiate from each other. And in this environment, special interest groups rushed into that space and flourished for a number of years. Now, turning to the globalists for a moment, the elites of Davos, Mr. Harper observes, and like many others, the elites of Davos can live anywhere and thus have less attachments to a particular community or country. And this is leading to more of a post-national state concept that some of the globalists are pushing lately. Retail or manufacturing or resource workers, in Canada, for example, are not as free and mobile and are more susceptible to technological change or competition from abroad. And these we'll call localists. And for localists, their future hinges on the society in which they live. And it's not an ideological take, it's a necessity. So the globalists constantly point to bad national policies. But in actuality, when we look at recent events and historical events, often it's in fact national policy that provides the fabric necessary for well-governed markets. The global community has provided little to nothing in the range of institutions or practices that well-governed markets require. And it's still the critical functions and laws and regulations and monetary and fiscal stability and conflict management and resolution and social services and redistribution, all that has been provided almost exclusively by nation states. So it is, in fact, the nation state is still the concrete reality, and it is a concrete reality, whereas globalism is a concept. Now, turning back to localists, the retail, manufacturing, and resource workers, working class, they require more certainty, and they don't have the luxury of relying on a concept such as globalism like the elites of Davos can. So those that can live anywhere are beholden to nowhere. And that means they have no responsibility to anyone or anything. It kind of reminds me of some of our current federal government players. In the meantime, there's a divergence of social and economic realities between the elites and regular working people, and this in fact drives more populism. Now, to fight globalism is not what anyone's talking about, but there is a slight, it's not an all or nothing approach either. Whereas the progressives would consider globalism as just simply as a force that cannot be avoided, it's inevitable. And for Harper, it's not quite as binary as that. He does suggest that globalism is here and it's here to stay. He just simply seems to infer that we can take it in bite-sized chunks. And we can selectively select certain aspects of globalism and regulate and manage other aspects of it. So it's not an all or nothing approach that Harper suggests that it's not an all or nothing approach that's required of any leader in navigating globalist forces. In terms of immigration, Mr. Harper is generally satisfied with his administration's pro-immigration stance, and he's actually reflecting on, he's quite proud of being one of the only center-right parties during his tenure that did not turn to an anti-immigration stance. His one regret, or one of his regrets there, was, however, with the temporary foreign worker program, particularly when it was expanded to low-skilled workers. And under that scheme, the temporary foreign worker program grew, and he didn't quite feel comfortable with that evolution, as in his mind, immigration was always intended to be a path towards citizenship. So when that happened, and then certain media reports identified a few unscrupulous employers that were taking advantage and abusing the system, that essentially painted all employers accessing a temporary foreign worker program as unscrupulous, made it politically unsaleable, and to continue to adequately support that program. Now, it's just fascinating reading this, because during that time, between 2008 and 2014, me and my firm were involved in temporary foreign worker programs, but at a skilled level where for workers that were making well into the six-figure range, making exactly what Canadians would make. In fact, it was more expensive to bring in temporary foreign workers than versus a domestically sourced worker. But so from my perspective, during when the temporary foreign worker started to become unhinged through the low-skilled temporary foreign worker component of it, and also examples of employers that were just behaving badly, I witnessed that politically that temporary foreign worker program space was just vacated. No one wanted to touch it at the federal government level to support it and make it work better. Harper does talk about the need to guard against illegal immigration, but also says that it's important in this day and age to continue to be pro-immigration in terms of economic immigration and refugee or compassionate immigration. But it goes on to say that mere sentiment is not enough to make good public policy. And there's just a lot of complicated pieces to the immigration scheme, setup, and program that requires a lot of hard work to take it to full implementation. Harper introduces a concept or a word of populist conservatism, and he puts that forward as possibly a solution or one of the solutions to governing in the age of disruption and increased populism. And he describes this as putting conservative values and ideas to the service of working people and their families. It is about using conservative means for populist ends. And for me, that's Mr. Harper speaking, it is the product of political experience. So he goes further to say that a populist conservative would be both a proponent of market economics and a skeptic of market dogmatism. So there's a belief that the market is a powerful tool, but also needs government oversight, regulation, and sometimes intervention. And he also goes into describing both from his own perspective, but also a requirement to making something like a populist conservatism approach work would be required a certain humility that would lead to small incremental approaches to change as opposed to drastic changes, which I think there's a lot of wisdom into that. Harper goes on to talking about rediscovering conservatism and bringing us back to conservatives focusing on the issues at hand versus the policy to be applied. And this is in contrast to the liberals who really get locked in on the policy that they wish to apply. And liberals confuse the concept they refer to as evidence-based decision-making as faith-based decisions, worshipping an academic or non-empirical academic disciplines. It's actually Benjamin Disraeli that said conservatives have a disposition to conserve with the ability to improve. And conservatives use empirical-based decision-making practices and wish to apply human insight to real-world problems. So there's a real grounding in what Harper aspires to being a conservative solution to what we're facing today. So conservative principles properly applied are well suited to face the issues giving rise to populist pressures. But it's not the old ideas either. And it's not the inflammatory ideas either, but true growth and solutions. And he contrasts this with the liberal approaches and even some of the old conservative approaches to populism is to call it out and call those that feel certain ways stupid, radical, racist, and that doesn't work. It hardens the populists and produces the opposite and equally visceral result. Conservatives err and have erred with their own certain dogmatism, reminiscing on Reaganism and applying his policy absent consideration for today's context. Free trade, low taxes, deregulation worked and was unequivocally appropriate in Reagan's time. Reagan was a great leader, politician. He was an actor, and of course had a persona. The conservatives perpetuated this persona, and as a negotiator, I know a little bit about personas. They are used as a positioning tool, a defense mechanism. One thing about personas, once established, they don't change unless they're torn down. And because they don't change, they become artificial and irrelevant, as all things changes. The basic principles of Reagan's approach are valid, but dogmatic approaches to his policy application is no more effective than the liberals worshipping the latest and greatest academic theorem, absent that theorem being grounded in the reality of issues facing today. There's also the track of caring for folks, and liberals have a persona of their own where their persona is to care about people, but they tend to care about people in the abstract, not real people like displaced coal miners or permanently disabled war veterans. For them, for those that complain, they get condescension, insults, and then are often written off as populists. In contrast to conservative approaches, Mr. Harper says that liberals would use any excuse to dismantle institutions, structures, without doing the work and understanding the historical context. Absent wisdom, sustained by an adolescent rage, and still always willing to jump on the next trendy idea, no matter how vacuous. So Harper calls on everyone to do better than that. First, there's a humility to admit that history and institutions have much to teach us. And the wisdom contained within our history and in our institutions are more expansive than our own. And two, we must evolve our own policies to meet current situations in our rapidly changing world. We're reaching intellectual adulthood. So having said that, markets, nation states, family, and faith are here for a reason and embody important lessons. Back to markets, they are powerful, but they're not perfect. And Harper reflected some time on the necessity in his book, on the necessity of his role in participating fully in the car bailout, the auto bailout. And the moral of the story for him was that many attach conservatism to a dogmatic faith in markets. And conservatism is not about markets. Conservatism is about making economies work. And markets generally work to that end, but when they do not, conservatives must do what's necessary to make it work. Markets work and tap into human strengths, but they're complex and require governance. And it's necessary to understand that, particularly in this age of disruption. Mastering this can give us major tools to tackle major issues. Policy needs to consider economic stability, cost of living, entrepreneurship, consumer interests, the creation of jobs in an environment of rapid technological change. In the middle of all this, markets have imperfections, and while each imperfection does not require government intervention, certain deviations have been left to fester and grow. Like certain financial markets, for example, and the US subprime mortgage issue was probably the most perfect example. And like that, because of globalism, because of our interconnectedness globally, there was a global contagion that caused a ripple effect, but it was actually the nation states that put in place the solutions and measures that drove the solution to that major financial crisis. So there's still a heavy reliance on nation states in this global environment to implement the measures required to govern these complex situations. And it's also important to remember that governments do not create jobs, economics do. Harper then went on to talk about some of the record or his perspectives also on trade negotiations and trade agreements, which is very much at issue today in much of the news. For Harper, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, CETA, was something that he reached an agreement in principle during his administration. And he reflects that upon reaching the agreement in principle, every single interest group uniquely affected, perceived or real, we knew would be preparing a response. No one would be surprised on Harper's team. They already knew what they were doing, and they knew how it would impact each group. They did the work. Harper's government was a trade agreement government. This is not to be mistaken as a trade at any cost approach. They did the work. They made choices based on a wide range of real-world economic considerations. This was not trade theory along a narrow set of corporate interests. And the deals that were reached with 46 different countries. And the formula was simple for him and outlined as follows: careful analysis, large-scale consultations, patience, right choices, and effective communications. Trade negotiations are about the careful evaluations of the real economic benefits and costs. They are not about academic theories. Theory can indicate which trade deals might be beneficial, but it does not make any agreement automatically beneficial. Trade negotiations are not modeling free trade for a simplified textbook economy. They are supposed to be acting on behalf of a complex real-world economy that has both interests to advance and interests to protect, according to the former Prime Minister. So rooting trade negotiations in the broad interests of working people and their family is required. We have to be realistic about the downsides to be avoided, and the downsides to be mitigated to acceptable levels. And the focus again needs to be on the working class. And legitimate concerns about trade impacts need to be addressed without falling into a general protectionism stance. So Harper's talking about a scalpel here versus a broadsword. He goes on to say that ideological, dogmatic approaches can fetter the required pragmatism for specific outcomes. And he sees this error on both sides, the Liberals, but also even in his own party, Maxime Bernier, lamenting on true conservatism and free markets. He would have fallen into the trap just as easily as the Liberals do by subscribing to all free trade is good no matter what, as long as it's along the lines of progressive agenda. So as a negotiator, if one doesn't do the work, we'll get it wrong every time, and if you do get it right, it's by accident. And it seems to be the same thing that Prime Minister Harper is saying here. Moving on to nationalism versus alienism. Nationalism taken too far is nativism or protectionism and can lead to racism. Globalism, on the other hand, taken too far can lead to elitism, anti-democratic forces, and those with a globalist stance can be dangerously disconnected from the communities that might be impacted by the policies, and therefore they would lack the empathy to understand the impact their policies are having on those within the community. So what's important is there needs to be a balance. It can act as a safeguard to those extremes and also would safeguard the interests of working people. And this is the language of responsibility. And that is positive nationalism, instilling a shared sense of citizenship, which would further civil society. Failure to do this leads to division. So what about businesses? Mr. Harper says is that we need to recognize what is a tool and what is an end. Keep that in our mind. Markets, globalization, trade, and immigration are tools. They're not ends. The end is to further the interest of working citizens. And trust is a big issue. The working class do not trust businesses and will not listen if talked at rather than talked to. The way my own firm operates is we're often called in to be relief pitchers, so to speak, or to close a deal or to fix a situation that's gone off the rails. Otherwise, my firm wouldn't be called, typically. And many times I see business associates, and if they had respect for their union counterparts, they lost it, or perhaps they never had it at all. And that drives probably 80-90% of the problems that they're facing, and I explain. If you're talking to someone that you don't respect, the person you're speaking to knows you don't respect them. You can't fake that. Maybe in politics you can, but not in the intimate situations at the bargaining table that we face. And usually if you don't have respect for someone, it's an inside job to fix it. The real problem is looking at you right in the mirror. And if you're talking to someone you don't respect, you're generally talking at them, around them, about them, but rarely to them. And folks aren't stupid. They can tell. Trust will never evolve effectively while this is the case. So back to Harper. He says the job number one for business is rebuilding trust. And it's not about making people listen. It's about behaving in a way that generates confidence. A good portion of trust is trustworthiness. And businesses cannot fake it if they're to be successful in the long term. Harper also says, have faith in the middle and don't focus on your opponents. They will never be your ally. We see this with the grand bargain of late with the Alberta NDP and the federal Liberals. Their focus was communicating to various foreign-funded environmental groups. That did not make allies out of them. They are paid to disrupt. So Harper is telling business leaders to focus on their middle. With regard to public policy, businesses do have a role to play with regard to public issues and public policy, according to Harper, but only do so in the promotion and consistency of each company's central vision. My firm's central vision, Workforce Delivery Inc., is to support job development, creation, and project execution in Western Canada. And that puts our firm squarely immersed into many current public policy issues, in a frustrating way, quite frankly. And we've offered comments, perhaps when we shouldn't have, perhaps. And we've not commented maybe when we should have. We do the best we can, and speaking from experience, when our commentary is grounded in responsibility and less on fear and emotion, it is more likely that the right balance will be reached. And I can just say that from personal experience, I think that that's the case. Harper goes on to say that innovation is the best business response. In fact, it is the main solution to many of today's issues. So he calls on businesses to invest, hire, and contribute to the communities with which it operates, and to be trustworthy and earn trust. To conclude, Harper says conservatives must build an agenda based on enduring values that is focused on how working people and their families face today. We must address concerns about market economics, trade, globalization, and immigration, and he's generally in favor of all of these, but interventions are a must, and we cannot be dogmatic or ideological. Otherwise, we'd be no different than the globalist elites disconnected from the realities of the current situation and the realities of the people impacted by the policies that they make. currently there's a deepening division of those that live somewhere and those that live anywhere, the localists and the globalists, the working families and the elites. And in a world of rapid, unpredictable change, ordinary people are vulnerable. So stable and responsive politics is needed as an essential ingredient to maintain a strong and dynamic society. And just my own personal comment, this brings us to the conclusion of the book review portion of Mr. Harper's book. But I just found it an absolute pleasure to read, and I look forward to just putting together an agenda to attack a number of concepts that he set out here for us and see if, as labor relations practitioners, we can apply it to different aspects of our profession. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to future podcasts where we get into how we might take these kinds of concepts and apply it in a useful way in our own professions. Thank you.